The 4 pieces that I broke it into, minor improvements, but the quality is much higher. You can see this guys came out pretty good, clean, not a lot of cleanup lines that I have to do.
So this should work out pretty good. Added a couple connector spots here, kind of like Legos, so they'll clip together. But the idea is that might have to sand them down every once in a while. You'll see the 3D printers, you know, they're good, but they're not perfect, and so we got a little bit of overage on here, and you end up having to sand them down, but they should all lock together. So you'll have them locked together like this, and you put a couple screws in to pin them in, and that'll hold it in place. But we'll have the 4 pieces lined up. So these are the reprints, and the 4 pieces that were reprinted, and so you'll see how these stack up here. So it looks something like this when they're all put together. Nothing too crazy, but it's a lot of fun. It looks like a M72 launcher. And so today I'm going to show you how to put these together. We're taking a look at these 4 pieces here. I'm getting them cleaned up. We'll cut up the ABS plastic. What you'll need for this project, obviously a 3D printer. So you need the 3D printer to print out the major components, and then also the internal components. So I just happen to throw them all in a little tray here. But you'll see, so like this for example, it's the front sight, front flip up sight. This would be the trigger, lower trigger mechanism. Holds the rod, aluminum rod, and fires the TagInn shell. The trigger itself, plastic trigger. This is lever release for the extension tube. Flip up sight front release. Upper trigger mechanism. This holds the gas refill gas fitting. This holds the trigger mechanisms in place underneath. The rear flip up sight. This was a second extension release. I ended up extending this after doing the first prototype and playing with it. Seems like I needed a couple more millimeters. This way it can hold the tube better. The tube was sliding out past the extension release, so this one's actually needs to get recycled. This is a guide for the rod, so that way the rod has some stability, less chance of it bending or flexing. You'll need, this is actually the spring cap, so this holds the spring in for the trigger mechanism. We've got here the cover plate for the gas fill area. The only problem I had with this one on the print, this warped a little bit too. Not sure, it was really cold here in Spokane, and so the you can see it's a little bent, but it could have been because of the ambient temperature in the garage is in the 40s. The printer heat plate is usually 60 degrees Celsius, and if it didn't adhere very well as it cooled, it started to warp a little bit. So I can hit this with the heat gun and try to straighten it out. This is a cover plate for the front sight release. Gas fitting. So for the gas fittings, we're actually going to need this one here. This will be from the grenade out. So you can see here I was already test fitting this. But essentially, this is another guide rod. So this will hold the aluminum rod, which will push the firing pin in the middle of the TagInn shell. So you see that there. And so this cover bolts on. This sleeve here is the shell holder. So this grenade shell holder should be perfect size for this. This is TagInn round, or TagInn shell, the CO2 version. So that way you can use the refilling, the portable refill fist, or another cheap one. I just use a cheap one. This gas fitting here, which I'll list out. So this is, I replaced, actually I'll go that back to show you guys. This is the original. This is what your gas shell normally comes in like. It'll come in something like this. So you'll need a regular TagInn shell or any other CO2 or green gas, grenade shell, whatever kind of shell you want to use. But one that we can replace the gas fill valve with. And so you'll see here, this one is a male 1032 by 1/4 inch push to connect for the gas shell. And then this will be to receive the 1/4 inch line, and we'll end up putting the fill valve here in the end here, so that way you can fill the grenade launcher shell without having to take the shell out of the grenade launcher itself. So you need those. I've got a spring here for the front sight release, small spring, and again I'll list in the description all of the information on the parts that I ended up picking up that end up being a part of this project. You'll see these roller pins here. So we've got these roller pins. So this will be for the front sights and the extension release. So I've got 3 of these. These are my 1/2 inch 4mm screws that I use throughout, and I'll include a link to those too. And a couple other set screws in there, so miscellaneous hardware. That was probably about $5 worth of hardware from Ace. Nothing fancy, but it's all general hardware store stuff that you can use. And so we'll be able to put this together today using all of those pieces. So first thing I typically do, once the 3D print's done and you've cleaned up and removed all the temporary supports, get everything organized here. You're going to want to have your tools, and the tools, well, in addition to the tools, other materials we need, obviously. Aluminum rod. So here's the aluminum rod, just round, typical aluminum rod. Got a 1/4 inch here by 36 inch. It's the one I picked up from Home Depot. This guy. Aluminum slider or galvanized adjustable bracket. We'll use this for the extension release. It also acts as a secondary safety for the trigger. So you can see this extension, so it slides in and out. I've got the ABS plastic piping itself. So 2-foot ABS pipe. This is 2-inch. Pre-cut from Home Depot, pre-cut 2-inch by 2 feet. And then these are the couplers for it. 2-inch couplers. Act as end cap. So you'll be using these on the ends here when we build it. Alright, so you're going to want to make sure that you've taken some time to sand down all the edges, the high spots, anything that might hang up the function of the launcher or catch on, your skin or clothes. Make sure all the components are tight fitting. They're snug, but don't break them. And if you don't force it. If it's hard to connect, just sand it down a little bit more. Give it a little bit of clearance. And that should be all you need. In regards to the rear section, this section is extremely important that it functions and all the components can move smoothly within the rear section. We have the rear lower trigger mechanism, and the lower trigger mechanism slides forward and backwards. That's what actually pushes the firing pin on the launcher or the TagInn round, and so this absolutely needs to move freely. So you're going to make sure that is moving smoothly. It'll push up against the upper trigger mechanism. And so if either of those surfaces are rough, it won't slide smoothly, so they need to slide smoothly against each other. Make sure that there's no edges or anything there that is going to hinder the movement. Our next step is going to be to cut the ABS tube. You're going to cut it, one side needs to be 13 inches long and the other half needs to be 11 inches long. Makes it pretty easy. We buy a pre-cut 2-foot section from Home Depot of ABS tube. Remember, this is the 2-inch pipe. Don't accidentally cut your 1.5 inch pipe. The 11-inch section is the section you're going to use for the front. You're going to end up notching it, and so the notch that we need to make is approximately 1.5 inch by 8 inch, and that's going to have a little bit of an extra notch there down at the bottom right corner, and that's going to be for us to ensure that the gas valve has clearance. Alright, next, test fit everything, make sure that all the clearances are acceptable. I'm just showing you here how I came up with the size of the notch. Obviously it's a rough cut. If you guys need to sand out or cut out more, feel free. It's not structural or performing any other function. But I just cut ours with the Dremel tool. Works pretty good. Get a good blade and cut through it. The ABS plastic is the only thing I've ever run into, and the problem with it is sometimes it melts onto itself, and so you got to tap it every once in a while with a hammer just to break out the section that you're working on. Next thing we're going to do is install the gas shell, the grenade shell into the grenade shell holder. There's a spot for a set screw. That little spot for the set screw goes towards the rear of the grenade shell. That will sit on there's like a lip within the grenade itself, so that'll keep it from falling out or sliding backwards. You'll see two other set screw spots. We're not using those at this point. Make sure that the grenade shell can slide freely through the tube. When you push in the set screw here, what you'll notice is that the set screw will keep the grenade from going backwards and falling out of the sleeve. The grenade shell holder itself, the sleeve there is sized correctly so that way the grenade shell won't go forward. Do not over tighten the set screw. What you'll notice is the set screw, when it starts getting tight, it'll actually bump out the plastic on the shell holder. And once you do that, if you push it out too much, you won't be able to fit it in the 2-inch ABS tube. It should be snug, but you need to be able to push it through freely. The next piece we're going to install is a grenade shell retainer, grenade retainer, and basically this is a guide for the aluminum rod that pushes on the firing pin. You're going to want to test fit it, make sure it's working good. The other important piece is the gas fill valve. It needs to be towards the bottom of the shell. That way you can access that fill valve. We're going to be replacing that later with a different fill valve that has a push to connect. Make sure you install the set screw. Next, we're going to replace the fill valve. You can use a flathead screwdriver to replace the fill valve. Just turn it out counterclockwise. Make sure this shell I'm using is a CO2 shell. Make sure you have the right shell for what you're building. I chose a CO2 so I can use the portable CO2 filler. But you're going to replace the fill valve with it's a 1032 by 1/4 inch push to connect gas fitting. This one's a male version. And so it should thread right in. Make sure you get some Teflon tape on there, helps keep it sealed. Otherwise you might end up with some minor gas leaks. It should thread right in. Make sure that you tighten it by hand. Just give it a couple turns with a wrench once you're tightened by hand. Don't over tighten it. These are pretty thin threads and it'll be easy to strip out or snap off the fitting if you're not careful. So do not over tighten the gas fitting. And then we're going to test it out as well, so you'll be able to hear if it does need to get a little more tight or a little looser. What you're going to do with the female fitting, the gas fitting, is you're going to install the original gas fill valve in it. Same thing, add some Teflon tape to it and thread that in just until it's snug. If you over tighten it, you'll notice the O-ring will bulge on the top, and then you'll end up with a gas leak. So don't over tighten that. Here you can see I got a 1/4 inch macro line from paintball gun. Make sure you use the right macro line. They have different PSI ratings. I don't want to see anyone get hurt, so make sure that your macro line is properly rated. I have seen, because the CO2 is up to 850 PSI typically, I've seen macro lines burst when they're not appropriately sized. So make sure you install the grenade retainer on the grenade shell. It takes 2 screws, and the 2 screws are the 2 forwardmost screws. You'll see how it lines up. Tighten those down with the Allen key. Sometimes I pre-thread it just so that way I know that it'll mesh up pretty well with the receiving side. So install those 2 screws, and then you'll slide the grenade shell forward until the grenade shell hits the housing, the front section housing, the green housing part, and it should line right up. Once you've got the grenade shell flushed forward, you'll see it pushes up against the green housing. Install the 2 last screws, and the 2 last screws do a couple things. It connects the front, the side section that holds the flip-up sight, the midsection that has the CCD logo on it, and then it also holds the grenade in place. Don't forget to install those 2 screws because it holds the grenade in place. If you fire without the 2 screws there, it might cause some trouble. Here I've installed the gas fittings on the ends of the 1/4" macro line, just testing it, make sure I've got enough line and that I can actually maneuver the gas fitting to fit in the gas fitting holder. I designed a gas fitting holder, a bracket basically into the side of the housing there, and it should fit snug right in there with no problems. Next step, install the retainer, basically the other half of that gas fitting holder, that little bracket there. And it just takes 2 screws. It's a little bit of a pain if you have the macro line in because the macro line is stiff, but it just takes 2 screws and a little bit of patience. Once you get the 2 Allen bolts in there, the gas fill valve should be stable. The next item here, we're taking a look at the rear section. We're going to connect the 2 halves of the rear section. And right now there's just dry fit, but we're going to see how the whole rear section goes together. Working on the trigger mechanism. The lower trigger mechanism portion here, it has the 1/4" aluminum rod, and so we'll push the aluminum rod towards the back of the lower trigger mechanism. I just tapped it in with a rubber mallet and made sure that that was snug. There's 2 spots there for set screws if you need to install a set screw to hold the rod. It should be tight enough that it doesn't require it, but if you need it, you can. The rod should be cut approximately 335 millimeters in length, and that way it has enough length to push in the grenade shell and fire it. You're going to want to notch the 13" section of ABS piping. You're going to make the cut about approximately 4 inches from the edge. Make a 2" by 2.5" cut, and this will provide clearance for the trigger mechanism into the rear section. Make sure you test fit everything. The rear section has a retainer. It's pretty thick plastic. That specific spot is one of the potential weak spots of the design, so that's why I reinforced it, made it thicker. It has 4 screw locations, and make sure you use all 4 of those. But basically, you'll see it feed through the tube here, the trigger rod, and making sure that it's clear with the lower trigger retainer. The next step, you're going to want to get a spring, find a spring for the trigger mechanism. The spring I use is approximately 5.1 millimeters in diameter and approximately 35.4 millimeters length. I used a universal kit from Amazon, and it has some of the springs that I need. Most of the time it has the springs that I need, and so it's been sufficient. I didn't have to order any custom springs or anything crazy. And so I just test fit the spring in here to make sure that it seats correctly, and that it also has enough tension to push the trigger button back up after I fired the launcher. Make sure that the spring moves freely. There's a little spring guide basically built into the design in the rear section. You'll see that the spring will go right there in the hole. Make sure that it can move freely through there. If it binds up anywhere, make sure you sand down any edges. the spring needs to move freely so that way the trigger returns to the original position after you fire the launcher. Here you're going to want to connect the upper trigger mechanism, the lower trigger mechanism, and the retaining cap, and feed them all into the rear section of the launcher. This is basically the entire trigger assembly. Here's the upper trigger mechanism, and so make sure you install them with the orientation correctly. The orientation should be as shown here: the upper trigger mechanism, the lower trigger mechanism, and the retainer. Install the upper and lower trigger mechanisms at the same time. So you can feed one side in. Snap it together. Make sure it's sitting flush, and that all the components are moving freely. Next step, install all 4 of those screws that hold that retainer in place. It's critical that you install that. Like I said, that takes the majority of the force when pushing up against the TagInn shell. If this area is not reinforced, it will snap if you try to shortchange the structural screws that are there. After we're done installing that, we're going to test the movement on the trigger mechanism itself. There's always going to be a little bit of play in it, and so that's why we have some guides for the trigger rod. You'll see in the front section that holds it stable, so that way that deflection doesn't cause any issues. The next piece, we're going to take a look at install the spring for the trigger, and so you push that through the guide. Like I said, there's a hole there. It lines right up with the lower trigger mechanism. And so all you gotta do is feed the spring through, and then there's a spring cap that you've 3D printed. Compress the spring. The spring cap itself has an indentation basically to hold the spring on the cap side. So compress it with whatever you need to. I used a wire pick and compress the spring and then push the snap in place. And so after you've pushed the cover in place, you can secure it with 2 screws. It just has 2 little screws there. They take a little bit of time to install, but it'll hold the trigger spring appropriately for a long time of use. After the spring cap's installed, we're going to install the trigger mechanism, the actual trigger button itself. The trigger button itself goes up top. Only needs 1 screw to hold it in place, and you'll see that snap it in first. It should pressure fit on top of the upper trigger mechanism, and then thread the single screw through. Alright, after you're done installing the trigger mechanism into the rear section, you're going to want to test the motion on it. Make sure that it's moving freely. The aluminum bar should move forward approximately 6 millimeters or so, and return. The spring that you installed should cause the trigger to return on its own. Feed it through the rear section ABS pipe, see how it lines up, and then the next thing we're going to do is finish assembling the rear section in its entirety. There's only 2 screws left, and you just assemble the 2 screws to connect the 2 sections together. Alright, so the next thing you're going to do is you're going to basically have 2 halves complete. Double check that the trigger function still works. Always test everything after you make a modification, that way you don't have to tear the whole thing apart. You're going to test fit the two sections together. Make sure you use the rod guide that's built in, and that way everything's actually lined up the way it's supposed to. You see that it's right there in the middle, outside the grenade shell, and so the aluminum rod should feed right through there. That'll help guide the rod to make sure that it's actually pushing on the firing pin. If the rear section doesn't sit flush, you're going to want to trim it, and you can trim it as needed. When that's complete and everything's flush, you're going to start drilling the pilot holes in the ABS piping for all of the mounts, for all the screws that secure the front section and the rear section to the actual ABS pipe. So use a 30-second drill bit and follow all of the existing holes that are already designed into the 3D model. Here you'll see that I wasn't able to get the two sections to sit flush, so I did have to trim off a little bit from the rear section. Looks like maybe ½ an inch or so. I just cut a little bit, test fit, and cut a little bit more if I need to. For the most part, it's designed so you have a little bit of leeway. There's a little bit of slack in the precision and how long the ABS pipe needs to be, so it should mount right up with minor modifications. Well, when the entire launcher is assembled, you should be able to test the gas fitting, and so I'm going to do a dry fire here and just test it out. Sometimes you have to push the trigger a few times to reseat and reset the actual grenade shell itself, and so there you go. Once it's reseated, it'll hold the CO2 like it's supposed to. When you're done testing or adjusting any of the gas hoses for leaks or anything like that, then you're going to install the cover. If everything is holding tight, install the cover. It's just 2 screws. You'll see there's a hole pre-made and designed so that way you can fill the gas shell. You don't have to drill anything in the lid there. Next step after that, we're going to start notching the back section, the back ABS pipe, making sure that that extension release lever can do what it needs to. For that to function correctly, you're going to need a spring. So measure out where that where the release lever lands on the pipe, router that out, and then pick the appropriate spring. Line it all up and check the fit. Next, we're going to need to make sure you pull out your roller pin and test fit that. Now, it's going to be a snug fit, and it's designed to be that way. And also, roller pins aren't exactly round, and so make sure you've got a round file. Utilize a round file to smooth out any edges. That way, it'll make sure that the roller pin can actually move in and also hold the levers. And we're going to have to do the same thing for the flip-up sights and this rear extension release. Tap it in with a nylon hammer. There's a little bit of extra on there. Just trim that off with a cutoff wheel and a Dremel tool. So that way it's appropriately sized. You could look for a shorter roller pin from the hardware store. I just bought 3 of the same kind and didn't have to waste more time shopping. Check the release, extension release, make sure it works with the spring. and then we're going to start sizing up the actual extension pipe itself. So taking a look at where the extension pipe's, how far forward it can move before it actually hits anything. This scenario looks like we can have about 8 inches on the extension pipe, and so mark the extension pipe and then cut it as needed. Make sure you test fit everything as usual, see how it will fit or won't fit. And this side I can see where I'm starting to hit the extension release along with the trigger mechanism, and so this gives me an idea of where I need to start notching the extension piece, so that way it clears the internal components. What you end up with after you measure everything out and end up filling everything in, you get an extension piece that's notched out, and the notch is going to be approximately an approximately 2-inch by 4-inch cut, and then have 2 small 1/2-inch by 1/2-inch square notches cut out of it, and that's for the extension release itself. Here I'm just going to show you how I made the notches, kind of how I came up with the rough cuts, so you can see how I was measuring it out and continually trimming, guess and check and test fit it until found the right solution and the right cuts and what I needed, just a little bit at a time. For our next step, we're going to want to install the rear flip-up sight cover on top of the extension tube end cap. And to do that, you just drill 2 holes, utilize the existing pilot holes from where the screw should go, and drill those into there. You want to try to flush it up to the back portion of the end cap as far back as you can, but try to keep everything level and flushed out. Alright, when you've completed installing the rear flip-up sight cover, we're going to move on to measuring out and cutting up the extension slide bar. It helps stabilize it, also makes it look similar to the existing law. And so you'll see that the existing slide bar's got these, one side of it can overlap the other, and that's the one we want to go inside of the rear section of the launcher. That little extra 1 inch, 2 inches of metal actually act as a second safety for the launcher, so that way it doesn't accidentally go off. So when the extension's collapsed, it blocks the trigger from depressing the TagInn shell. Alright, once you're done measuring out the extension bar, you're going to want to make sure you cut off the little tabs that are left at the bottom. Don't remove the vertical piece that has the hole in there, because we're actually going to attach via screw. We're going to attach through that hole to the both the extension end cap and the rear section of the launcher. The rear slider bar may be a little loose, and so make sure you check everything out, file any rough edges. It's going to need to slide into the rear section pretty easily, that way it doesn't get caught up on the rear section housing. So make sure you test everything. Just file down items that are a little oversized, or sand them down. When you're done installing the extension bar slider, you're going to want to start working on the sights. So the flip up sights, you have a front and rear flip up sight. The first thing you want to do is install the front sight latch. It also has a spring that it uses, so you'll see there's a little nub on the latch. That nub needs to be the orientation of the nub needs to be upward, so that way the spring can be seated correctly on it. Make sure you install the front sight latch cover. The cover holds the spring in place and also keeps that front sight latch from falling out of place. And so it should fit. It's pretty snug, but it should block the spring and the actual sight release from coming undone. So it'll be a little loose, but it should have some play in it, but it'll hold the sight no problem. Once you're done installing the front sight latch, you're going to start working on making springs and focusing on installing the actual flip-up sights themselves. Again, just like with the rear extension release, you're going to make sure you sand out any of the holes where the roller pins are going to go into, and so that way they have clear movement. Making springs is a little challenging. It took me a while to get used to it, but you can make springs with piano wire. And so if you buy some, I got some off Amazon. Again, I always have the parts listed below in the description here, but I ended up making or drilling out a bolt or a roller pin, and that way I had the right diameter for the spring, and then wrapping the spring around until I made a torsional spring that I needed for the flip-up sights. There's the extension stabilizer that I've printed out. What this does is help make sure that the extension piece itself doesn't wobble too much, because the 1.5 inch pipe to the 2 inch pipe has a pretty significant gap. The stabilizer will hold that, make sure that doesn't move. The way it's seated, it'll seat right in front of the rear cap on the 2 inch pipe, so install that. Check the fit. Like I said, it'll be really tight. What you'll notice is that the ABS, the 1.5 inch ABS pipe that we notched out, the diameter of that is significantly smaller and slides easy. Once you get towards the back of the extension pipe, it starts to rub on the stabilizer, and so you might have to sand down either the actual 1.5 inch pipe or the stabilizer itself, or both, so that way it moves smoothly in and out. The main thing is we have a tapered 1.5 inch pipe, and so that ends up causing trouble. Still working on a solution for that, and could be something I do in the future to improve the design. But for right now, I just sanded down the extension pipe so that way it can move through the stabilizer with no issues. And that concludes the build. If you've enjoyed this, please feel free to share it. Feel free to also send me a message or leave comments if there's something else you want me to take a look at designing and building. I really enjoyed designing and building this. I also had the infrared laser version that I built for Pegasus Milsim. This was spawned after that was designed from a couple other airsoft players in the community that wanted something to fire TagInn rounds. If you've got something you want to build, feel free to hit me up. I'd love working on this type of stuff, and would love to help continue to enhance the gameplay that we have for our airsoft community. Thanks for everyone for watching, and hope you have fun and be safe. We'll see you on the